Before the Revolution of 1944, which overthrew the Ubico dictatorship, farm laborers had been roped together by the army for delivery to the lowland farms where they were kept in debt slavery by the landowners. The expropriation of large tracts of uncultivated acreage, which was distributed to approximately 100,000 landless peasants, the improvement in union rights for the workers, and other social reforms were the reasons Arbenz had won the support of communists and other leftists, which was no more than to be expected. When Arbenz was criticized for accepting communist support, he challenged his critics to prove their good faith by backing his reforms themselves. They failed to do so, thus revealing where the basis of their criticism lay. The party formed by the Communists, the Guatemalan Labor Party, held 4 seats in Congress, the smallest component of Arbenz's ruling coalition, which commanded a total of 51 seats in the 1953-54 legislature. Communists held several important sub-cabinet posts, but none was ever appointed to the cabinet. In addition, there were communists employed in the bureaucracy, particularly in the administration of land reform. Lacking anything of substance they could accuse the Guatemalan left of, Washington officials were reduced to condemnation by semantics. Thus, communists, unlike normal human beings, did not take jobs in the government, they infiltrated the government. Communists did not support a particular program, they exploited it. Communists did not back Arbenz, they used him. Moreover, communists controlled the labor movement and land reform. But what type of person is it who devotes himself in an underdeveloped country to furthering the welfare of workers and peasants? None other than the type that Washington calls communist. The basic idea behind the employment of such language, which was standard Western fare throughout the Cold War, was to deny the idea that communists could be people sincerely concerned about social change. American officials denied it to each other as well as to the world. Here, for example, is an excerpt from a CIA report about Guatemala, prepared in 1952 for the edification of the White House and the intelligence community. Communist political success derives in general from the ability of individual communists and fellow travelers to identify themselves with the nationalist and social aspirations of the Revolution of 1944. In this manner, they have been successful in infiltrating the administration and pro-administration political parties and have gained control of organized labor. Arbenz is essentially an opportunist whose politics are largely a matter of historical accident. The extension of communist influence has been facilitated by the applicability of Marxist clichés to the anti-colonial and social aims of the Guatemalan Revolution. The first plan to topple Arbenz was a CIA operation approved by President Truman in 1952. But at the 11th hour, Secretary of State Dean Acheson persuaded Truman to abort it. However, soon after Eisenhower became president in January 1953, the plan was resurrected. Both administrations were pressured by executives of United Fruit Company, much of whose vast and uncultivated land in Guatemala had been expropriated by the Arbenz government as part of the land reform program. The company wanted nearly $16 million for the land. The government was offering $525,000. United Fruit's own declared valuation for tax purposes. United Fruit functioned in Guatemala as a state within a state. It owned the country's telephone and telegraph facilities, administered its only important Atlantic harbor, and monopolized its banana exports. A subsidiary of the company owned nearly every mile of railroad track in the country. The fruit company's influence amongst Washington's power elite was equally impressive. On a business and or personal level, it had close ties to the Dulles brothers, various State Department officials, congressmen, the American ambassador to the United Nations, and others. And Whitman, the wife of the company's public relations director, was President Eisenhower's personal secretary. Undersecretary of State and formerly director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith was seeking an executive position with United Fruit at the same time he was helping to plan the coup. He was later named to the company's board of directors. Under Arbenz, Guatemala constructed an Atlantic port and a highway to compete with United Fruit's holdings, and built a hydroelectric plant to offer cheaper energy than the US-controlled electricity monopoly. Arbenz's strategy was to limit the power of foreign companies through direct competition rather than through nationalization. A policy not feasible, of course, when it came to a fixed quantity like land. In his inaugural address, Arbenz stated that foreign capital will always be welcome as long as it adjusts to local conditions, remains always subordinate to Guatemalan laws, cooperates with the economic development of the country, and strictly abstains from intervening in the nation's social and political life. This hardly described United Fruit's role in Guatemala. Amongst much else, the company had persistently endeavored to frustrate Arbin's reform programs, discredit him and his government, and induce his downfall. Arbin's was, accordingly, wary of multinationals and could not be said to welcome them into his country with open arms. This attitude, his expropriation of United Fruit's land, and his tolerance of communists were more than enough to make him a marked man in Washington. The United States saw these policies as being interrelated. That is, it was communist influence, not any economic or social exigency of Guatemalan life, which was responsible for the government's treatment of American firms. In March 1953, the CIA approached disgruntled right-wing officers in the Guatemalan army and arranged to send them arms. United Fruit donated $64,000 in cash. The following month, uprisings broke out in several towns but were quickly put down by loyal troops. The rebels were put on trial and revealed the Fruit Company's role in the plot, but not the CIA's. The Eisenhower administration resolved to do the job right the next time around. With cynical glee, almost an entire year was spent in painstaking, step-by-step preparation for the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Of the major CIA undertakings, few have been as well documented as has the coup in Guatemala. With the release of many formerly classified government papers, the following story has emerged. Headquarters for the operation were established in Opalaca, Florida, on the outskirts of Miami. The Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza leased his country out as a site for an airstrip and for hundreds of men, Guatemalan exiles and U.S. and Central American mercenaries, to receive training in the use of weapons and radio broadcasting, as well as in the fine arts of sabotage and demolition. 30 airplanes were assigned for use in the Liberation, stationed in Nicaragua, Honduras, and the Canal Zone, to be flown by American pilots. The Canal Zone was set aside as a weapons depot from which arms were gradually distributed to the rebels who were to assemble in Honduras under the command of Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas before crossing into Guatemala. Soviet-marked weapons were also gathered for the purpose of planting them inside Guatemala before the invasion to reinforce U.S. charges of Russian intervention. And, as important as arms, it turned out, hidden radio transmitters were placed in and around the perimeter of Guatemala, including one in the U.S. Embassy. An attempt was made to blow up the trains carrying the Czech weapons from Portside to Guatemala City. However, a torrential downpour rendered the detonators useless, whereupon the CIA paramilitary squad opened fire on one train, killing a Guatemalan soldier and wounding 3 others. But the convoy of trains made it safely to its destination. After the Czech ship had arrived in Guatemala, Eisenhower ordered the stopping of suspicious foreign flag vessels on the high seas off Guatemala to examine cargo. The State Department's legal advisor wrote a brief which concluded in no uncertain terms that such action would constitute a violation of international law. No matter, at least 2 foreign vessels were stopped and searched, 1 French and 1 Dutch. It was because of such actions by the British that the United States had fought the War of 1812. The Guatemalan military came in for special attention. The U.S. ostentatiously signed mutual security treaties with Honduras and Nicaragua, both countries hostile to Arbenz, and dispatched large shipments of arms to them in the hope that this would signal a clear enough threat to the Guatemalan military to persuade it to withdraw its support of Arbenz. Additionally, the U.S. Navy dispatched 2 submarines from Key West, saying only that they were going south. Several days later, the Air Force, amid considerable fanfare, sent 3 B-36 bombers on a courtesy call to Nicaragua. The CIA also made a close study of the records of members of the Guatemalan Officer Corps and offered bribes to some of them. One of the agency's clandestine radio stations broadcast appeals aimed at military men, as well as others, to join the liberation movement. The station reported that Arbenz was secretly planning to disband or disarm the armed forces and replace it with a people's militia. CIA planes dropped leaflets over Guatemala carrying the same message. Eventually, at Ambassador Purifoy's urging, a group of high-ranking officers called on Arbenz to ask that he dismiss all communists who held posts in his administration. The president assured them that the communists did not represent a danger, that they did not run the government, and that it would be undemocratic to dismiss them. At a second meeting, The officers also demanded that Arbenz reject the creation of the People's Militia. At one point, the CIA offered Arbenz himself a large sum of money, which was rejected. The money, which was deposited in a Swiss bank, presumably was offered to induce Arbenz to abdicate or to serve as a means of later claiming he was corrupt. On the economic front, contingency plans were made for such things as cutting off Guatemalan credit abroad, disrupting its oil supplies, and causing a run on its foreign reserves. But it was on the propaganda front that American ingenuity shone at its brightest. Inasmuch as the Guatemalan government was being overthrown because it was communist, the fact of its communism would have to be impressed upon the rest of Latin America. Accordingly, the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, began to place unattributed articles in foreign newspapers labeling particular Guatemalan officials as communist and referring to various actions by the Guatemalan government as communist-inspired. In the few weeks prior to Arben's fall alone, more than 200 articles about Guatemala were written and placed in scores of Latin American newspapers. Employing a method which was to become a standard CIA/USIA feature all over Latin America and elsewhere, as we shall see, articles placed in one country were picked up by newspapers in other countries, either as a result of CIA payment or unwittingly because the story was of interest. Besides the obvious advantage of multiplying the potential audience, the tactic gave the appearance that independent world opinion was taking a certain stand and further obscured the American connection. The USIA also distributed more than 100,000 copies of a pamphlet entitled Chronology of Communism in Guatemala throughout the hemisphere, as well as 27,000 copies of anti-communist cartoons and posters. The American propaganda agency, moreover, produced 3 films on Guatemala with predictable content and newsreels favorable to the United States for showing free in cinemas. Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, a prelate possessed of anti-communism, a man who feared social change more than he feared God, was visited by the CIA. Would His Reverence arrange CIA contact with Archbishop Mariano Russell Arellano of Guatemala? The Cardinal would be delighted. Thus it came to pass that on April 9, 1954, a pastoral letter was read in Guatemalan Catholic churches calling to the attention of the congregations the presence in the country of a devil called communism and demanding that the people rise as a single man against this enemy of God and country, or at least not rally in Arben's defense. To appreciate the value of this, one must remember that Guatemala's peasant class was not only highly religious, but that very few of them were able to read, and so could receive the Lord's word only in this manner. For those who could read, many thousands of pamphlets carrying the Archbishop's message were airdropped around the country. In May, the CIA covertly sponsored a Congress against Soviet intervention in Latin America in Mexico City. The same month, Somoza called in the diplomatic corps in Nicaragua and told them, his voice shaking with anger, that his police had discovered a secret Soviet shipment of arms, which had been planted by the CIA, near the Pacific coast, and suggested that the communists wanted to convert Nicaragua into a new Korean situation. A few weeks later, an unmarked plane parachuted arms with Soviet markings onto Guatemala's coast. On such fare did the people of Latin America dine for decades. By such tactics were they educated about communism. In late January 1954, the operation appeared to have suffered a serious setback when photostat copies of liberation documents found their way into Arben's hands. A few days later, Guatemala's newspapers published copies of correspondence signed by Castillo Armas, Somoza, and others under banner headlines. The documents revealed the existence of some of the staging, training, and invasion plans involving, amongst others, the government of the North. The State Department labeled the accusations of a U.S. role ridiculous and untrue, and said it would not comment further because it did not wish to give them a dignity they did not deserve. Said a department spokesperson, "It is the policy of the United States not to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations. This policy has repeatedly been reaffirmed under the present administration." Time magazine gave no credence whatsoever to the possibility of American involvement in such a plot, concluding that the whole expose had been masterminded in Moscow. The New York Times was not so openly cynical, but its story gave no indication that there might be any truth to the matter. Latin American observers in New York reported the newspaper, said the plot charges savored of communist influence. This article was followed immediately on the page by one headed Red Labor Chief's Meet. Guatemalan Confederation opens its Congress, and the CIA continued with its preparations as if nothing had happened. The offensive began in earnest on June 18th, with planes dropping leaflets over Guatemala demanding that Arbenz resign immediately or else various sites would be bombed. CIA radio stations broadcast similar messages. That afternoon, the planes returned to machine gun houses near military barracks, dropped fragmentation bombs, and strafed the National Palace. Over the following week, the air attacks continued daily, strafing or bombing ports, fuel tanks, ammunition dumps, military barracks, the international airport, a school, and several cities. 9 persons, including a 3-year-old girl, were reported wounded. An unknown number of houses were set afire by incendiary explosives. During one nighttime raid, a tape recording of a bomb attack was played over loudspeakers set up on the roof of the U.S. Embassy to heighten the anxiety of the capital's residents. When Arbenz went on the air to try and calm the public's fear, the CIA radio team jammed the broadcast. Meanwhile, the agency's army had crossed into Guatemala from Honduras and captured a few towns. But its progress in the face of resistance by the Guatemalan army was unspectacular. On the broadcasts of the CIA's Voice of Liberation, the picture was different. The rebels were everywhere and advancing. They were of large numbers and picking up volunteers as they marched. War and upheaval in all corners. Fearsome battles and major defeats for the Guatemalan army. Some of these broadcasts were transmitted over regular public and even military channels, serving to convince some of Arbenz's officers that the reports were genuine. In the same way, the CIA was able to answer real military messages with fake responses. All manner of disinformation was spread and rumors fomented. Dummy parachute drops were made in scattered areas to heighten the belief that a major invasion was taking place. United Fruit Company's publicity office circulated photographs to journalists of mutilated bodies about to be buried in a mass grave as an example of the atrocities committed by the Arbenz regime. The photos received extensive coverage. Thomas McCann of the company's publicity office later revealed that he had no idea what the photos represented. They could just as easily have been the victims of either side or of an earthquake. The point is, they were widely accepted for what they were purported to be, victims of communism. In a similar vein, Washington officials reported on political arrests and censorship in Guatemala without reference to the fact that the government was under siege, let alone who was behind the siege, that suspected plotters and saboteurs were the bulk of those being arrested, or that, overall, the Arbenz administration had a fine record on civil liberties. The performance of the American press in this regard was little better. The primary purpose of the bombing and the many forms of disinformation was to make it appear that military defenses were crumbling, that resistance was futile, thus provoking confusion and division in the Guatemalan armed forces and causing some elements to turn against Arbenz. The psychological warfare conducted over the radio was directed by E. Howard Hunt, later of Watergate fame, and David Atlee Phillips, a newcomer to the CIA. When Phillips was first approached about the assignment, he asked his superior, Tracy Barnes, in all innocence, "But Arbenz became president in a free election. What right do we have to help someone topple his government and throw him out of office?" For a moment, wrote Phillips later, I detected in his face a flicker of concern, a doubt, the reactions of a sensitive man. But Barnes quickly recovered and repeated the party line about the Soviets establishing an easily expandable beachhead in Central America. Phillips never looked back. When he retired from the CIA in the mid-1970s, he founded the Association of Retired Intelligence Officers, an organization formed to counteract the flood of unfavorable publicity sweeping over the agency at the time. American journalists reporting on the events in Guatemala continued to exhibit neither an investigative inclination nor a healthy conspiracy mentality. But what was obscure to the U.S. press was patently obvious to large numbers of Latin Americans. Heated protests against the United States broke out during this week in June in at least 11 countries, and was echoed by the governments of Ecuador, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, which condemned American intervention and aggression. Life magazine noted these protests by observing that world communism was efficiently using the Guatemalan show to strike a blow at the U.S. It scoffed at the idea that Washington was behind the revolt. Newsweek reported that Washington officials interpreted the outcry as an indication of the depth of red penetration into the Americas. A State Department memo at the time, however, privately acknowledged that much of the protest emanated from non-communist and even pro-American moderates. On the 21st and the 22nd of June, Guatemalan Foreign Minister Torriello made impassioned appeals to the United Nations for help in resolving the crisis. American UN Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge tried to block the Security Council from discussing a resolution to send an investigating team to Guatemala, characterizing Torriello's appeals as communist maneuvers. But under heavy pressure from UN Secretary-General Dag Hammarskjöld, the Council was convened. Before the vote, while Lodge worked on the smaller nations represented on the Council, Eisenhower and Dulles came down hard on France and Great Britain, both of whom favored the resolution. Said the President of the United States to his Secretary of State, "The British expect us to give them a free ride and side with them on Cyprus, and yet they won't even support us on Guatemala. Let's give them a lesson." As matters turned out, the resolution was defeated by 5 votes to 4, with Britain and France abstaining, although their abstentions were not crucial inasmuch as 7 votes were required for passage. Hammarskjöld was so upset with the American machinations, which he believed undercut the strength of the United Nations, that he confided that he might be forced to reconsider my present position in the United Nations. During this same period, the CIA put into practice a plan to create an incident. Agency planes were dispatched to drop several harmless bombs on Honduran territory. The Honduran government then complained to the UN and the Organization of American States, claiming that the country had been attacked by Guatemalan planes. Arbenz finally received an ultimatum from certain army officers: resign or they would come to an agreement with the invaders. The CIA and Ambassador Purifoy had been offering payments to officers to defect, and one army commander reportedly accepted $60,000 to surrender his troops. With his back to the wall, Arbenz made an attempt to arm civilian supporters to fight for the government, but army officers blocked the disbursement of weapons. The Guatemalan president knew that the end was near. The voice of liberation, meanwhile, was proclaiming that 2 large and heavily armed columns of invaders were moving towards Guatemala City. As the hours passed, the further advance of the mythical forces was announced, while Castillo Armas and his small band had actually not progressed very far from the Honduran border. The American disinformation and rumor offensive continued in other ways as well, and Arbenz, with no one he could trust to give him accurate information, could no longer be certain that there wasn't at least some truth to the radio bulletins. Nothing would be allowed to threaten the victory so near at hand. A British freighter docked in Guatemala and suspected of having arrived with fuel for Arbenz's military vehicles was bombed and sunk by a CIA plane after the crew had been warned to flee. It turned out that the ship had come to Guatemala to pick up a cargo of coffee and cotton. A desperate Torriello pleaded repeatedly with Ambassador Purifoy to call off the bombings, offering even to reopen negotiations about United Fruit's compensation. In a long cable to John Foster Dulles, the foreign minister described the aerial attacks on the civilian population, expressed his country's defenselessness against the bombings, and appealed to the United States to use its good offices to put an end to them. In what must have been a deeply humiliating task, Torriello stated all of this without a hint that the United States was, or could be, a party to any of it. The pleas were not simply too late. They had always been too late. The Castillo Armas forces could not have defeated the much larger Guatemalan army, but the air attacks, combined with the belief in the invincibility of the enemy, persuaded Guatemalan military officers to force Arbenz to resign. No communists, domestic or foreign, came to his aid. He asked the head of the officers, Army Chief of Staff Colonel Carlos Diaz, only that he give his word not to negotiate with Castillo Armas, and Diaz, who despised the rebel commander as much as Arbenz did, readily agreed. What Diaz did not realize was that the United States would not be satisfied merely to oust Arbenz. Castillo Armas had been groomed as the new head of government, and that was not negotiable. A CIA official, Enno Hobbing, who had just arrived in Guatemala to help draft a new constitution for the incoming regime, told Diaz that he had made a big mistake in taking over the government. "Colonel," said Hobbing, "you're just not convenient for the requirements of American foreign policy." Presently, Purifoy confronted Diaz with the demand that he deal directly with Castillo Armas. At the same time, the ambassador showed the Guatemalan colonel a long list of names of some leaders, requiring that Diaz shoot them all within 24 hours. But why? Diaz asked. Because they're communists, replied Purifoy. Although Diaz was not a communist sympathizer, he refused both requests and indicated that the struggle against the invaders would continue. Purifoy left, livid with anger. He then sent a simple cable to CIA headquarters in Florida. We have been double-crossed. Bomb! Within hours, a CIA plane took off from Honduras, bombed a military base, and destroyed the government radio station. Gulaxio. Castillo Armas, whose anti-communism the United States could trust, was soon the new leader of Guatemala. The propaganda show was not yet over. At the behest of the CIA, Guatemalan military officers of the new regime took foreign correspondents on a tour of Arbin's former residence where they could see for themselves rooms filled with school textbooks published in, yes, the Soviet Union. The New York Times correspondent, Paul Kennedy, considered to be strongly anti-Arbin's, concluded that the books had been planted and did not bother to report the story. Time made no mention of the books either, but somehow came upon the story that mobs had plundered Arbin's home and found stacks of communist propaganda and 4 bags of earth, one each from Russia, China, Siberia, and Mongolia. Times article made it clear enough that it now knew of the American role in Arbin's downfall, although certainly not the full story. But the magazine had nothing to say about the propriety of overthrowing a democratically elected government by force. Castillo Armas celebrated the liberation of Guatemala in various ways. In July alone, thousands were arrested on suspicion of communist activity. Many were tortured or killed. In August, a law was passed and a committee set up which could declare anyone a communist, with no right of appeal. Those so declared could be arbitrarily arrested for up to 6 months, could not own a radio or hold public office. Within 4 months, the committee had registered 72,000 names. A committee official said it was aiming for 200,000. Further implementation of the agrarian reform law was stopped, and all expropriations of land already carried out were declared invalid. United Fruit Company not only received all its land back, but the government banned the banana workers' unions as well. Moreover, 7 employees of the company who had been active labor organizers were found mysteriously murdered in Guatemala City. The new regime also disenfranchised 3/4 of Guatemala's voters by barring illiterates from the electoral rolls and outlawed all political parties, labor confederations, and peasant organizations. To this was added the closing down of opposition newspapers, which Arbin's had not done, and the burning of subversive books, including Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, Dostoevsky novels, and the works of Guatemala's Nobel Prize-winning author Miguel Angel Asturias, a biting critic of United Fruit. Meanwhile, John Foster Dulles, who was accused by Torriello of seeking to establish a banana curtain in Central America, was concerned that some communists might escape retribution. In cables he exchanged with Ambassador Purifoy, Dulles insisted that the government arrest those Guatemalans who had taken refuge in foreign embassies and that criminal charges be brought against them to prevent them leaving the country, charges such as having been covert Moscow agents. The Secretary of State argued that communists should be automatically denied the right of asylum because they were connected with an international conspiracy. The only way they should be allowed to leave, he asserted, was if they agreed to be sent to the Soviet Union. But Castillo Armas refused to accede to Dulles's wishes on this particular issue, influenced perhaps by the fact that he, as well as some of his colleagues, had been granted political asylum in an embassy at one time or another. One of those who sought asylum in the Argentine embassy was a 25-year-old Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara. Guevara, who had been living in Guatemala since sometime in 1953, had tried to spark armed resistance to the invading forces, but without any success. Guevara's experience in Guatemala had a profound effect upon his political consciousness. His first wife, Hilda Gadea, whom he met there, later wrote, "Up to that point, he used to say he was merely a sniper criticizing from a theoretical point of view the political panorama of our America. From here on he was convinced that the struggle against the oligarchic system and the main enemy, Yankee imperialism, must be an armed one, supported by the people." In the wake of the coup, the United States confiscated a huge amount of documents from the Guatemalan government, undoubtedly in the hope of finally uncovering the hand of the international communist conspiracy behind Arbin's. If this is what was indeed discovered, it has not been made public. On June 30th, while the dust was still settling, Dulles summed up the situation in Guatemala in a speech which was a monument to Cold War speak. The events in Guatemala exposed the evil purpose of the Kremlin to destroy the inter-American system, having gained control of what they call the mass organizations. The communists moved on to take over the official press and radio of the Guatemalan government. They dominated the Social Security Organization and ran the agrarian reform program. Dictated to the Congress and to the president, Arbenz was openly manipulated by the leaders of communism. The Guatemalan regime enjoyed the full support of Soviet Russia. The situation is being cured by the Guatemalans themselves. When it came to rewriting history, however, Dulles' speech had nothing on these lines from a CIA memo written in August 1954, and only for internal consumption no less. When the communists were forced by outside pressure to attempt to take over Guatemala completely, they forced Arbenz to resign, deleted. They then proceeded to establish a communist junta under Colonel Carlos Diaz. And in October, John Purifoy sat before a congressional committee and told them, "My role in Guatemala prior to the revolution was strictly that of a diplomatic observer. The revolution that overthrew the Arbenz government was engineered and instigated by those people in Guatemala who rebelled against the policies and ruthless oppression of the communist-controlled government." Later, Dwight Eisenhower was to write about Guatemala in his memoirs. The former president chose not to offer the slightest hint that the United States had anything to do with the planning or instigation of the coup, and indicated that his administration had only the most tangential of connections to its execution. When Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs were published in the West, the publisher saw fit to employ a noted criminologist to annotate the work, pointing out errors of omission and commission. Thus it was that the educated, urbane men of the State Department, the CIA and the United Fruit Company, the pipe-smoking, comfortable men of Princeton, Harvard, and Wall Street, assured each other that the illiterate peasants of Guatemala did not deserve the land which had been given to them, that the workers did not need their unions, that hunger and torture were a small price to pay for being rid of the scourge of communism. The terror carried out by Castillo Armas was only the beginning. It was, as we shall see, to get much worse in time. It continued without pause for more than 40 years. In 1955, the New York Times reported from the United Nations that the United States has begun a drive to scuttle a section of the proposed Covenant of Human Rights that poses a threat to its business interests abroad. The offending section dealt with the right of peoples to self-determination and to permanent sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources. Said the newspaper, "It declares in effect that any country has the right to nationalize its resources." 11. Costa Rica mid-1950s. Trying to topple an ally, Part 1. If ever the CIA maintained a love-hate relationship, it was with Jose Figueres, 3 times the head of state of Costa Rica. On the one hand, Figueres, by his own admission in 1975, worked for the CIA in 20,000 ways, all over Latin America for 30 years. "I collaborated with the CIA when we were trying to topple Trujillo," he divulged, speaking of the Dominican Republic dictator. On the other hand, Figueres revealed that the agency had twice tried to kill him. He did not elaborate, although he stated at the same time that he had tried for 2 years to get the Bay of Pigs invasion called off. This may have precipitated one or both of the assassination attempts. The CIA also tried to overthrow the Figueres government. In 1964, the first significant exposé of the agency, the Invisible Government, disclosed that in the mid-1950s CIA agents intruded deeply into the political affairs of Costa Rica, the most stable and democratic republic in Latin America. Knowledgeable Costa Ricans were aware of the CIA's role. The CIA's purpose was to promote the ouster of Jose Pepe Figueres, the moderate socialist who became president in a fair and open election in 1953. Figueres remained in office until 1958, in this his first term as president. He had headed a liberal junta in the late 1940s. The agency's major grievance was that Figueres had scrupulously recognized the right of asylum in Costa Rica, for non-communists and communists alike. The large influx of questionable characters complicated the agency's job of surveillance and forced it to increase its staff. The CIA's problems with Figueres actually went somewhat deeper. Costa Rica was a haven for hundreds of exiles fleeing from various Latin American right-wing dictatorships, such as in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and Figueres was providing groups of them with material and moral support in their plans to overthrow these regimes. To Figueres, this was entirely in keeping with his anti-totalitarian beliefs, directed against the left as well as the right. The problem was that the dictators targeted for overthrow were all members in good standing of the United States Anti-Communist Free World Club. The American attitude toward Trujillo was later modified. Moreover, Figueres had on occasion expressed criticism of the American policy of supporting such dictatorships while neglecting the economic and social problems of the hemisphere. These considerations could easily outweigh the fact that Figueres had established his anti-communist credentials, albeit not of the ultra variety, and was no more a socialist than U.S. Senator Hubert Humphrey. Although Figueres spoke out strongly at times against foreign investment, as president he was eminently accommodating to Central America's bête noirs, the multinational fruit companies. In addition to providing support to Figueres's political opponents, the CIA, reported the Invisible Government, tried to stir up embarrassing trouble within the Communist Party in Costa Rica and to attempt to link Figueres with the communists. An effort to produce evidence that Figueres had been in contact with leading communists during a trip to Mexico was unsuccessful. But CIA agents had better luck with the first part of their strategy, stirring up trouble for the communists. They succeeded in planting a letter in a communist newspaper. The letter, purportedly from a leading Costa Rican communist, put him on record in opposition to the party line on the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. Unaware that the letter was a CIA plant, the leading officials in the American embassy held an urgent meeting to ponder its meaning. The political officer then dispatched a long classified report to Washington, alerting top policymakers to the possibility of a startling turn in Latin American communist politics. In 1955, the agency carried out an action against Figueres that was more immediately threatening. A deep personal and political animosity between Figueres and Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza had escalated into violence. An attempt against Somoza's life, launched from Costa Rica with Figueres' support, was countered by an invasion from Nicaragua by land and air. Figueres' biographer, Charles Emeringer, has related that Figueres accused the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency of aiding the Somoza movement against him. He claimed that the CIA felt indebted to Somoza for the help he had given in overthrowing the Arbenz regime. He asserted that the same pilots and planes, the F-47, that had participated in the attack upon Guatemala, afterwards came from Nicaragua and machine-gunned 11 defenseless towns in our territory. According to Figueres, at the same time that the U.S. Department of State arranged the sale of fighter planes for Costa Rica's defense, CIA planes and pilots were flying sorties for the rebels. It is interesting to note that during this period, when virtually nothing had yet been revealed about such blatant CIA covert activities, the fact that the agency had been caught red-handed tapping Figueres' telephone was worthy of condemnatory editorial comment by the Washington Post and a like statement by Senator Mike Mansfield on the floor of the Senate. Jose Figueres did not regain the presidency of Costa Rica until 1970. At which time a renewed CIA effort to overthrow him was undertaken, for not very different reasons. 12. Syria 1956 to 1957. Purchasing a new government. Neutrality, proclaimed John Foster Dulles in 1956, has increasingly become an obsolete conception, and, except under very exceptional circumstances, it is an immoral and short-sighted conception. The short-sightedness of the neutralist government lay perhaps in its inability to perceive that its neutralism would lead to John Foster Dulles attempting to overthrow it. Syria was not behaving like Washington thought a third world government should. For one thing, it was the only state in the area to refuse all U.S. economic or military assistance. Damascus did not much care for the strings which came attached. The acceptance of military aid usually meant the presence of American military advisors and technicians. Furthermore, the U.S. Mutual Security Act of 1955 specified that the recipient country agreed to make a contribution to the defensive strength of the free world and declared it U.S. policy to encourage the efforts of other free nations to foster private initiative and competition, i.e., capitalism. Another difficulty posed by Syria was that, although its governments of recent years had been more or less conservative and had refrained from unpleasant leftist habits like nationalizing American-owned companies, U.S. officials, suffering from what might be called anti-communist paranoia or being victims of their own propaganda, consistently saw the most ominous handwritings on the walls. To appreciate this, one has to read some of the formerly secret now declassified documents of the National Security Council, NSC, based in part on reports received from the American Embassy in Damascus during 1955 and 1956. If the popular leftward trend in Syria continues over any considerable period, there is a real danger that Syria will fall completely under left-wing control either by coup or usurpation of authority. The fundamental anti-US and anti-West orientation of the Syrians is stimulated by inevitable political histrionics about the Palestine problem. For successive short-lived governments in Syria have permitted continuous and increasing communist activities. The communists support the leftist cliques in the army. Apathy towards communism on the part of politicians and army officers is a threat to security. The Arab Socialist Resurrectionist Party, ASRP, and the Communist Party of Syria are capable of bringing about further deterioration of Syrian internal security, danger of ASRP coup d'etat, and increased communist penetration of government and army. Of all the Arab states, Syria is at the present time the most wholeheartedly devoted to a neutralist policy with strong anti-Western overtones. If the present trend continues, there is a strong possibility that a communist-dominated Syria will result, threatening the peace and stability of the area and endangering the achievement of our objectives in the Near East. We should give priority consideration to developing courses of action in the Near East designed to affect the situation in Syria and to recommending specific steps to combat communist subversion. It would appear that the idea of military men who were leftist and/or apathetic to communists must truly have been an incongruous phenomenon to the American official mind. But nowhere in any of the documents is there mention of the leftists/communists/ASRP having in fact done anything illegal or wicked, although the language employed is similar to what we saw in the Guatemala chapter. These people don't join anything. They infiltrate, they penetrate, they control, they're opportunistic. In actuality, the behavior described is like that of other political animals, trying to influence key sectors of the society and win allies. But to the men holding positions of responsibility in the National Security Council and the State Department, the evil intent and danger of such people was so self-evident as not to require articulation. There is one exception, perhaps expressed to explain away an uncomfortable observation. In fact, the Communist Party does not appear to have as its immediate objective seizure of power. Rather, it seeks to destroy national unity, to strengthen support for Soviet policies and opposition to Western policies, and to exacerbate tensions in the Arab world. It has made significant progress toward these objectives. There is no indication of what the author had in mind by national unity. A leftist-oriented or communist-dominated Syrian government, reasoned the U.S. ambassador to Syria, James Moose Jr., would clearly threaten American interests in neighboring Turkey, which in turn could outflank all the states of the NATO alliance, and so forth and so on. It was clear that since the Syrian government could not be relied upon to do anything about this major impending disaster, something would have to be done about the Syrian government. To this we add the usual Middle Eastern intrigue. In this case, Iraq plotting with the British to topple the governments in both Syria and Nasser's Egypt, the British pressuring the Americans to join the conspiracy, and the CIA compromising, leave Nasser alone at least for the time being and will do something about Syria. An implausible scenario, scandalous, but in the time-honored tradition of the Middle East. The British were old hands at it. Dulles and the Americans, still exulting in their king-making in Iran, were looking to further remake the oil region in their own image. Wilbur Crane Eveland was a staff member of the National Security Council, the high-level interagency group in Washington which, in theory, monitors and controls CIA clandestine activities. Because of Eveland's background and experience in the Middle East, the CIA had asked that he be lent to the agency for a series of assignments there. Archibald Roosevelt was, like his cousin Kermit Roosevelt, a highly placed official of the CIA. Both were grandsons of Teddy. Kermit had masterminded the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953. Archie had fond hopes of doing the same in Syria. Mikhail Bey Ilian had once served as Syria's foreign minister. In 1956, he was the leader of the Conservative Populist Party. At a meeting of these three men in Damascus, Syria on July 1, 1956, as described by Eveland in his memoirs, Roosevelt asked Ilian what would be needed to give the Syrian conservatives enough control to purge the communists and their leftist sympathizers. Ilian responded by ticking off names and places: the radio stations in Damascus and Aleppo, a few key senior officers, and enough money to buy newspapers now in Egyptian and Saudi hands. Roosevelt probed further. Could these things, he asked Ilian, be done with U.S. money and assets alone, with no other Western or Near Eastern country involved? Without question, Ilian replied, nodding gravely. On July 26th, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced that his government was taking over the operation of the Suez Canal. The reaction of the British and French was swift and inflamed. The United States was less openly hostile, though it was critical and Egyptian government funds in the US were frozen. This unexpected incident put a crimp in the CIA's plans. For, as Ilian explained to Eveland in despair, Nasser was now the hero of the Arab world, and collaboration with any Western power to overthrow an Arab government was politically indefensible. Eventually, the coup was scheduled for October 25th. The logistics, as outlined by Ilian, called for senior colonels in the Syrian army to take control of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. The frontier posts with Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon would also be captured in order to seal Syria's borders until the radio stations announced that a new government had taken over under Colonel Kabani, who would place armored units at key positions throughout Damascus. Once control had been established, Ilian would inform the civilians he'd selected that they were to form a new government. But in order to avoid leaks, none of them would be told until just a week before the coup. For this operation, money would have to change hands. Ilian asked for and received £500,000 Syrian pounds, approximately $167,000. The Syrian further stipulated that to guarantee their participation, the Syrian plotters would require assurance from the highest level of the American government that the US would both back the coup and immediately grant recognition to the new government. This, Ilian explained, could be communicated as follows. In April, President Eisenhower had said that the United States would oppose aggression in the Middle East, but not without congressional approval. Could the president repeat this statement in light of the Suez crisis, he asked, on a specified date when Ilian's colleagues would be told to expect it? Eisenhower's words would provide the guarantees they were seeking. An affirmative reply to Ilian's plan arrived in Damascus from Washington the next day. A proper occasion for the requested statement would have to be found, and Secretary Dulles would be the one to use it. The scheme was for Dulles to make public reference to Eisenhower's statement between the 16th and the 18th of October, thus giving Ilian the week he needed to assemble his civilian team. Before long, John Foster Dulles held a press conference. In light of recent Israeli attacks on Jordan, one of the reporters present asked whether the United States might come to Jordan's aid per our declaration of April 9th. Yes, replied the Secretary of State, repeating the reference to the April statement. The date was October 16th. But following close on the heels of this was a message from Ilian in Damascus to Eveland in Beirut postponing the date of the coup for 5 days to October 30th because Colonel Kabani had told Ilian that his people weren't quite ready. The postponement was crucial. Early in the morning of the 30th, a very distraught Mikhail Ilian appeared at Eveland's door. Last night, he cried, the Israelis invaded Egypt and are right now heading for the Suez Canal. How could you have asked us to overthrow our government at the exact moment when Israel started a war with an Arab state? The leftist trend in Syria bell continued to ring in Washington. In January 1957, wrote President Eisenhower later, CIA Director Allen Dulles submitted reports indicating that the new Syrian cabinet was oriented to the left. 2 months later, Dulles prepared a situation report on Syria, in which he wrote of an increasing trend toward a decidedly leftist, pro-Soviet government. Dulles was concerned with organized leftist officers belonging to the Arab Socialist Resurrection Party. That same month, a State Department internal document stated, the British are believed to favor active stimulation of a change in the present regime in Syria, in an effort to assure a pro-Western orientation on the part of future Syrian governments. The United States shares the concern of the British government over the situation in Syria. Then, in June, an internal Department of Defense memorandum spoke of a possible leftist coup. This was to be carried out, according to the memo, against the leftist Syrian government. Thus it was that in Beirut and Damascus, CIA officers were trying their hands again at stage managing a Syrian coup. On this occasion, Kermit Roosevelt, rather than cousin Archibald, was pulling the strings. He arranged for one Howard Rocky Stone to be transferred to Damascus from the Sudan to be sure that the engineering was done by a pro. Stone was, at 32, already a legend in the CIA's clandestine service as the man who had helped Kim Roosevelt overthrow the Iranian government 4 years earlier, though what Stone's precise contribution was has remained obscure. The proposed beneficiary of this particular plot was to be Adib Shishakli, former right-wing dictator of Syria, living covertly in Lebanon. Shishakli's former chief of security, Colonel Ibrahim Husseini, now Syrian military attaché in Rome, was secretly slipped into Lebanon under cover of a CIA-fabricated passport. Husseini was then to be smuggled across the Syrian border in the trunk of a U.S. diplomatic car in order to meet with key Syrian CIA agents and provide assurances that Shishakli would come back to rule once Syria's government had been overthrown. But the coup was exposed before it ever got off the ground. Syrian army officers who had been assigned major roles in the operation walked into the office of Syria's head of intelligence, Colonel Sarraj, turned in their bribe money and named the CIA officers who had paid them. Lieutenant Gulaxio, Robert Malloy, the American Army attaché, Francis Jetton, a career CIA officer, officially vice consul at the U.S. Embassy, and the legendary Howard Stone, with the title of Second Secretary for Political Affairs, were all declared persona non grata and expelled from the country in August. Gulaxio. Malloy was determined to leave Syria in style. As his car approached the Lebanese border, he ran his Syrian motorcycle escort off the road and shouted to the fallen rider that Colonel Sarraj and his commie friends should be told that Malloy would beat the shit out of them with one hand tied behind his back if they ever crossed his path again. The Syrian government announcement which accompanied the expulsion order stated that Stone had first made contact with the outlawed Social Nationalist Party and then with the army officers. When the officers reported the plot, they were told to continue their contacts with the Americans and later met Shishakli and Husseini at the homes of U.S. Embassy staff members. Husseini reportedly told the officers that the United States was prepared to give a new Syrian government between $300 and $400 million in aid if the government would make peace with Israel. An amusing aside to the affair occurred when the Syrian defense minister and the Syrian ambassador to Italy disputed the claim that Husseini had anything to do with the plot. The ambassador pointed out that Husseini had not been in Syria since July 20th, and his passport showed no indication that he had been out of Italy since that time. The State Department categorized the Syrian charge as complete fabrications and retaliated by expelling the Syrian ambassador and his second secretary and recalling the American ambassador from Syria. It marked the first time since 1915 that the United States had expelled a chief of mission of a foreign country. In the wake of the controversy, the New York Times reported that there are numerous theories about why the Syrians struck at the United States. One is that they acted at the instigation of the Soviet Union. Another is that the government manufactured an anti-US spy story to distract public attention from the significance of Syria's negotiations with Moscow. In the same issue, a Times editorial speculated upon other plausible-sounding explanations. Neither in its news report nor in its editorial did the New York Times seem to consider even the possibility that the Syrian accusation might be true. President Eisenhower, recalling the incident in his memoirs, offered no denial to the accusation. His sole comment on the expulsions was, "The entire action was shrouded in mystery, but the suspicion was strong that the communists had taken control of the government. Moreover, we had fresh reports that arms were being sent into Syria from the Soviet bloc." Syria's neutralism/leftism continued to obsess the United States. 5 years later, when John F. Kennedy was in the White House, he met with British Prime Minister Macmillan and the two leaders agreed, according to a CIA report, on penetration and cultivation of disruptive elements in the Syrian armed forces, particularly in the Syrian army, so that Syria can be guided by the West. Decades later, Washington was still worried, though Syria had still not gone communist. 13. The Middle East 1957 to 1958. The Eisenhower Doctrine claims another backyard for America. On March 9, 1957, the United States Congress approved a presidential resolution which came to be known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. This was a piece of paper, like the Truman Doctrine and the Monroe Doctrine before it, whereby the U.S. government conferred upon the U.S. government the remarkable and enviable right to intervene militarily in other countries. With the stroke of a pen, the Middle East was added to Europe and the Western Hemisphere as America's field of play. The resolution stated that the United States regards as vital to the national interest and world peace the preservation of the independence and integrity of the nations of the Middle East. Yet, during this very period, as we have seen, the CIA initiated its operation to overthrow the government of Syria. The business part of the resolution was contained in the succinct declaration that the United States is prepared to use armed forces to assist any Middle East country requesting assistance against armed aggression from any country controlled by international communism. Nothing was set forth about non-communist or anti-communist aggression which might endanger world peace. Wilbur Crane Eveland, the Middle East specialist working for the CIA at the time, had been present at a meeting in the State Department 2 months earlier called to discuss the resolution. Eveland read the draft, which stated that many, if not all, of the Middle East states are aware of the danger that stems from international communism. Later he wrote, "I was shocked, who, I wondered, had reached this determination of what the Arabs considered a danger. Israel's army had just invaded Egypt and still occupied all of the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. And, had it not been for Russia's threat to intervene on behalf of the Egyptians, the British, French, and Israeli forces might now be sitting in Cairo, celebrating Nasser's ignominious fall from power." The simplistic and polarized view of the world implicit in the Eisenhower Doctrine ignored not only anti-Israeli sentiments but currents of nationalism, pan-Arabism, neutralism, and socialism prevalent in many influential quarters of the Middle East. The framers of the resolution saw only a Cold War battlefield and, in doing so, succeeded in creating one. In April, King Hussein of Jordan dismissed his prime minister, Suleiman Nabulsi, amidst rumors, apparently well-founded, of a coup against the king encouraged by Egypt and Syria and Palestinians living in Jordan. It was the turning point in an ongoing conflict between the pro-West policy of Hussein and the neutralist leanings of the Nabulsi regime. Nabulsi had announced that in line with his policy of neutralism, Jordan would develop closer relations with the Soviet Union and accept Soviet aid if offered. At the same time, he rejected American aid because, he said, the United States had informed him that economic aid would be withheld unless Jordan severs its ties with Egypt and consents to settlement of Palestinian refugees in Jordan, a charge denied by the State Department. Nabulsi added the commentary that communism is not dangerous to the Arabs. Hussein, conversely, accused international communism and its followers of direct responsibility for efforts to destroy my country. When pressed for the specifics of his accusation, he declined to provide any. When rioting broke out in several Jordanian cities, and civil war could not be ruled out, Hussein showed himself equal to the threat to his continued rule. He declared martial law, purged the government and military of pro-Nasser and leftist tendencies, and abolished all political opposition. Jordan soon returned to a state of relative calm. The United States, however, seized upon Hussein's use of the expression international communism to justify rushing units of the Sixth Fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean. A super aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, followed shortly by a variety of other naval vessels and a battalion of Marines which put ashore in Lebanon to prepare for possible future intervention in Jordan. Despite the fact that nothing resembling armed aggression from any country controlled by international communism had taken place, the State Department openly invited the king to invoke the Eisenhower Doctrine. But Hussein, who had not even requested the show of force, refused, knowing that such a move would only add fuel to the fires already raging in Jordanian political life. He survived without it. Sometime during this year, the CIA began making secret annual payments to King Hussein, initially in the millions of dollars per year. The practice was to last for 20 years, with the agency providing Hussein female companions as well. As justification for the payment, the CIA later claimed that Hussein allowed American intelligence agencies to operate freely in Jordan. Hussein himself provided intelligence to the CIA and distributed part of his payments to other government officials who also furnished information or cooperated with the agency. A few months later, it was Syria which occupied the front stage in Washington's melodrama of international communism. The The Syrians had established relations with the Soviet Union via trade, economic aid, and military purchases and training. The United States chose to see something ominous in this, although it was a state of affairs engendered in no small measure by John Foster Dulles, as we saw in the previous chapter. American antipathy towards Syria was heightened in August following the Syrian government's exposure of the CIA-directed plot to overthrow it. Washington officials and the American media settled easily into the practice of referring to Syria as a Soviet satellite or quasi-satellite. This was not altogether objective or spontaneous reporting. Kenneth Love, a New York Times correspondent in close contact to the CIA, see Iran chapter, later disclosed some of the background. The U.S. Embassy in Syria connived at false reports issued in Washington and London through diplomatic and press channels to the effect that Russian arms were pouring into the Syrian port of Latakia, that not more than 123 MiGs had arrived in Syria, and that Lieutenant Colonel Abdul Hamid Seraj, head of Syrian intelligence, had taken over control in a communist-inspired coup. I traveled all over Syria without hindrance in November and December 1956, and found there were indeed not more than 123 MiGs. There were none, and no Russian arms had arrived for months. And there had been no coup, although some correspondents in Beirut, just a 2-hour drive from Damascus, were dispatching without attribution false reports fed to them by embassy visitors from Damascus and a roving CIA man who worked in the guise of a U.S. Treasury agent. Seraj, who was anti-communist, had just broken the clumsy British-U.S. Iraqi-supported plot to overthrow the Syrian government. Syria was quiet but worried lest the propaganda presage a new coup d'etat or a Western-backed invasion. As if to further convince any remaining skeptics, Eisenhower dispatched a personal emissary, Loy Henderson, on a tour of the Middle East. Henderson, not surprisingly, returned with the conclusion that there was a fear in all Middle East countries that the Soviets might be able to topple the regimes in each of their countries through exploiting the crisis in Syria. He gave no indication as to whether the Syrians themselves thought they were going through a crisis. As an indication of how artificial were the crises announced by the White House, how arbitrary were the doomsday pronouncements about the Soviet Union, let us consider the following from a Department of Defense internal memorandum of June 1957, about 2 months before Henderson went to the Middle East. The USSR has shown no intention of direct intervention in any of the previous Mideastern crises, and we believe it is unlikely that they would intervene directly to assure the success of a leftist coup in Syria. In early September, the day after Henderson returned, the United States announced that the Sixth Fleet was once again being sent to the Mediterranean and that arms and other military equipment were being rushed to Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. A few days later, Saudi Arabia was added to the list. The Soviet Union replied with arms shipments to Syria, Egypt, and Yemen. The Syrian government accused the U.S. of sending warships close to her coast in an open challenge, and said that unidentified planes had been flying constantly over the Latakia area day and night for 4 days, Latakia being the seaport where Soviet ships arrived. Syria further claimed that the U.S. had incited Turkey to concentrate an estimated 50,000 soldiers on Syria's border. The Syrians ridiculed the explanation that the Turkish troops were only on maneuvers. Eisenhower later wrote that the troops were at the border with a readiness to act, and that the United States had already assured the leaders of Turkey, Iraq, and Jordan that if they felt it necessary to take actions against aggression by the Syrian government, the United States would undertake to expedite shipments of arms already committed to the Middle Eastern countries and, further, would replace losses as quickly as possible. The president had no quarrel with the idea that such action might be taken to repel, in his words, the anticipated aggression of Syria, for it would thus be basically defensive in nature, emphasis added. The American role here may have been more active than Eisenhower suggests. One of his advisors, Emmett John Hughes, has written of how Undersecretary of State Christian Herter, later to replace an ailing John Foster Dulles as secretary, reviewed in rueful detail some recent clumsy clandestine American attempts to spur Turkish forces to do some vague kind of battle with Syria. Dulles gave the impression in public remarks that the United States was anxious to somehow invoke the Eisenhower Doctrine, presumably as a justification for taking further action against Syria. But he could not offer any explanation of how this was possible. Certainly Syria was not going to make the necessary request. The only solution lay in Syria attacking another Arab country which would then request American assistance. This appears to be one rationale behind the flurry of military and diplomatic activity directed at Syria by the US. A study carried out for the Pentagon some years later concluded that in the 1957 Syrian crisis, Washington seemed to seek the initial use of force by target. Emphasis added. Target refers to Syria. Throughout this period, Washington officials alternated between striving to enlist testimonials from other Arab nations that Syria was indeed a variety of Soviet satellite and a threat to the region, and assuring the world that the United States had received a profusion of just such testimony. But Jordan, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia all denied that they felt threatened by Syria. Egypt, Syria's closest ally, of course concurred. At the height of the crisis, King Hussein of Jordan left for a vacation in Europe. The Iraqi premier declared that his country and Syria had arrived at a complete understanding, and King Saud of Saudi Arabia, in a message to Eisenhower, said that U.S. concern over Syria was exaggerated, and asked the president for renewed assurances that the United States would refrain from any interference in the internal affairs of Arab states. Saud added that efforts to overturn the Syrian regime would merely make the Syrians more amenable to Soviet influence, a view shared by several observers on all sides. At the same time, the New York Times reported, from the beginning of the crisis over Syria's drift to the left, there has been less excitement among her Arab neighbors than in the United States. Foreign diplomats in the area, including many Americans, felt that the stir caused in Washington was out of proportion to the cause. Eventually, Dulles may have been influenced by this lack of support for the American thesis, for when asked specifically to characterize what the relation is between Soviet aims in the area and the part that Syria adds to them, he could only reply that the situation internally in Syria is not entirely clear and fluctuates somewhat. Syria, he implied, was not yet in the grip of international communism. The next day, Syria, which had no desire to isolate itself from the West, similarly moderated its tone by declaring that the American warships had been 15 miles offshore and had continued quietly on their way. It appears that during this same restless year of 1957, the United States was also engaged in a plot to overthrow Nasser and his troublesome nationalism, although the details are rather sketchy. In January, when King Saud and Iraqi Crown Prince Abdul-Illah were in New York at the United Nations, they were approached by CIA Director Allen Dulles and one of his top aides, Kermit Roosevelt, with offers of CIA covert planning and funding to topple the Egyptian leader whose radical rhetoric, inchoate though it was seen by the royal visitors as a threat to the very idea of monarchy. Nasser and other army officers had overthrown King Farouk of Egypt in 1952. Ironically, Kermit Roosevelt and the CIA have traditionally been given credit for somehow engineering this coup. However, it is by no means certain that they actually carried this out. Abdul-Illah, wrote Eveland, insisted on British participation in anything covert, but the Saudis had severed relations with Britain and refused. As a result, the CIA dealt separately with each, agreeing to fund King Saud's part in a new area scheme to oppose Nasser and eliminate his influence in Syria, and to the same objective, coordinating in Beirut a covert working group composed of representatives of the British, Iraqi, Jordanian, and Lebanese intelligence services. The conspiracy is next picked up in mid-spring at the home of Gon Zogby in Beirut. Zogby, of Lebanese ancestry, was the chief of the CIA Beirut station. He and Kermit Roosevelt, who was staying with him, hosted several conferences of the clandestine planners. So obvious, Eveland continued, were there covert gyrations with British, Iraqi, Jordanian, and Lebanese liaison personnel coming and going nightly, that the Egyptian ambassador in Lebanon was reportedly taking bets on when and where the next U.S. coup would take place. At one of these meetings, the man from the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, informed the gathering that teams had been fielded to assassinate Nasser. Shortly afterwards, Eveland learned from a CIA official that John Foster Dulles, as well as his brother Alan, had directed Roosevelt to work with the British to bring down Nasser. Roosevelt now spoke in terms of a palace revolution in Egypt. From this point on, we're fishing in murky waters, for the events which followed produced more questions than answers. With the 6 countries named above, plus Turkey and Israel apparently getting in on the act, and less than complete trust and love existing amongst the various governments, a host of plots, subplots, and side plots inevitably sprang to life. At times it bordered on low comedy, though some would call it no more than normal Middle East diplomacy. Between July 1957 and October 1958, the Egyptian and Syrian governments and media announced the uncovering of what appeared to be at least 8 separate conspiracies to overthrow one or the other government, to assassinate Nasser, and/or prevent the expected merger of the two countries. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United States were most often named as conspirators, but from the entanglement of intrigue which surfaced, it is virtually impossible to unravel the particular threads of the U.S. role. Typical of the farcical goings-on, it seems that at least one of the plots to assassinate Nasser arose from the Dulles brothers taking Eisenhower's remark that he hoped the Nasser problem could be eliminated to be in order for assassination, when the president, so the story goes, was merely referring to improved U.S.-Egyptian relations. Upon realizing the error, Secretary Dulles ordered the operation to cease. 3 years later, Allen Dulles was again to misinterpret a remark by Eisenhower as an order to assassinate Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. Official American pronouncements during this entire period would have had the world believe that the Soviet Union was the eminence grise behind the strife in Jordan, the crisis in Syria, and unrest generally in the Middle East, that the Soviet aim was to dominate the area, while the sole purpose of U.S. policy was to repel the Soviet thrust and maintain the independence of the Arab nations. Yet, on 3 separate occasions during 1957, in February, April, and September, the Soviet Union called for a 4-power US, USSR, Great Britain, and France declaration renouncing the use of force and interference in the internal affairs of the Middle Eastern countries. The February appeal had additionally called for a 4-power embargo on arms shipments to the region, withdrawal of all foreign troops, liquidation of all foreign bases, and a conference to reach a general Middle East settlement. The Soviet strategy was clearly to neutralize the Middle East, to remove the threat it had long felt from the potentially hostile control of the oil region by, traditionally, France and Great Britain, and now the United States, which sought to fill the power vacuum left by the decline of the 2 European nations as Middle East powers. History does not relate what a Middle East free from big power manipulation would have been like, for neither France, Great Britain, nor the United States was amenable to even calling the Soviet bluff, if that was what it was. The New York Times summarized the attitude of the 3 Western nations to the first 2 overtures as one that deprecated the Soviet proposals as efforts to gain recognition of a Soviet right to a direct voice in the affairs of the Middle East. They have told the Russians to take up their complaints through the United Nations. Following the September proposal, John Foster Dulles, replying to a question at a press conference, said that the United States is skeptical of these arrangements with the Soviet Union for hands-off. What they are apt to mean is our hands off and their hands under the table. This appears to be the only public comment the U.S. government saw fit to make on the matter. It may be instructive to speculate upon the reaction of the Western nations if the Soviet Union had announced a Khrushchev doctrine, ceding to itself the same scope of action in the Middle East as that stipulated in the Eisenhower doctrine. In January 1958, Syria and Egypt announced their plans to unite, forming the new nation of the United Arab Republic, UAR. The initiative for the merger had come from Syria, who was motivated in no small part by her fear of further American power plays against her. Ironically, under the merger arrangement, the Communist Party, already outlawed in Egypt, was dissolved in Syria, an objective which 1.5 years of CIA covert activity had failed to achieve. 2 weeks after the birth of the UAR, and in direct response to it, Iraq and Jordan formed the Arab Union, with the United States acting as midwife. This union was short-lived, for in July a bloody coup in Iraq overthrew the monarchy, the new regime establishing a republic and promptly renouncing the pact. The trumpets of Armageddon could once more be heard distinctly in the Oval Office. This somber turn of events, wrote Eisenhower in his memoirs, could, without vigorous response on our part, result in a complete elimination of Western influence in the Middle East. Although the president would not be so crass as to mention a concern about oil, his anxiety attack was likely brought on by the fact that one of the greatest oil reserves in the world was now under rule of a government which might well prove to be not as pliable an ally as the previous regime, and too independent of Washington. The time for a mere show of force was over. The very next day, U.S. military forces invaded Lebanon lest the popular impulse from Iraq serve to bring down the Lebanese government. Of all the Arab states, Lebanon was easily the United States' closest ally. She alone had supported the Eisenhower doctrine with any enthusiasm or unequivocally echoed Washington's panic about Syria. To be more precise, it was the president of Lebanon, Camille Chamoun, and the foreign minister, Charles Malik, a Harvard PhD in philosophy, who had put all their Cold War eggs into the American basket. Shamoun had ample reason to be beholden to the United States. Funds were also provided to specifically oppose, as punishment, those candidates who had resigned in protest over Shamoun's adherence to the Eisenhower Doctrine. As is customary in such operations, the CIA sent an election specialist, along with the money to Beirut to assist in the planning. American officials in Washington and Lebanon proceeded on the assumption. They told each other that Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia would also intervene financially in the elections. The American ambassador to Lebanon, Donald Heath, argued as well, apparently without ironic intention, that with both the president and the new Chamber of Deputies supporting American principles, we'd also have a demonstration that representative democracy could work in the Middle East. To what extent the American funding helped, or even how the money was spent, is not known, but the result was a landslide for pro-government deputies. So much so that it caused considerable protest within Lebanon, including the charge that Shamoun had stacked the parliament in order to amend the constitution to permit him to seek an otherwise prohibited second six-year term of office the following year. By late April 1958, tensions in Lebanon had reached bursting point. The inordinate pro-American orientation of Shamoun's government and his refusal to dispel rumors that he would seek a second term incensed both Lebanese nationalists and advocates of the Arab nationalism which Nasser was promoting throughout the Middle East. Demands were made that the government return to the strict neutrality provided for in the National Pact of 1943 at the time of Lebanon's declaration of independence from France. A rash of militant demonstrations, bombings, and clashes with police took place, and when, in early May, the editor of an anti-government newspaper was murdered, armed rebellion broke out in several parts of the country, and U.S. information agency libraries in Tripoli and Beirut were sacked. Lebanon contained all the makings of a civil war. Behind everything, wrote Eisenhower, was our deep-seated conviction that the communists were principally responsible for the trouble and that President Shamoun was motivated only by a strong feeling of patriotism. The president did not clarify who or what he meant by communists. However, in the next paragraph he refers, without explanation, to the Soviet Union as stirring up trouble in the Middle East. And on the following page, the old soldier writes that there was no doubt in our minds about Shamoun's charge that Egypt and Syria had been instigating the revolt and arming the rebels. In the midst of the fighting, John Foster Dulles announced that he perceived international communism as the source of the conflict, and for the third time in a year, the Sixth Fleet was dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean. Police supplies to help quell rioters, as well as tanks and other heavy equipment, were airlifted to Lebanon. At a subsequent news conference, Dulles declared that even if international communism were not involved, the Eisenhower Doctrine was still applicable because one of its provisions stated that the independence of these countries is vital to peace and the national interest of the United States. That is certainly a mandate, he said, to do something if we think that our peace and vital interests are endangered from any quarter. Thus did one of the authors of the doctrine bestow upon himself a mandate. Egypt and Syria, from all accounts, supported the rebels' cause with arms, men, and money, in addition to inflammatory radio broadcasts from Cairo, although the extent of the material support is difficult to establish. A UN observation group went to Lebanon in June at the request of Foreign Minister Malik and reported that they found no evidence of UAR intervention of any significance. A second UN report in July confirmed this finding. It is open to question, however, what degree of reliance can be placed upon these reports, dealing as they do with so thorny an evaluation and issued by a body in the business of promoting compromise. In any event, the issue was whether the conflict in Lebanon represented a legitimate, homegrown civil war, or whether it was the doing of the proverbial outside agitators. On this point, historian Richard Barnett has observed, no doubt the observation group did minimize the extent of UAR participation, but essentially they were correct. Nasser was trying to exploit the political turmoil in Lebanon, but he did not create it. Lebanon, which had always abounded in clandestine arsenals and arms markets, did not need foreign weapons for its domestic violence. Egyptian intervention was neither the stimulus nor the mainstay of the civil strife. Once again, a government that had lost the power to rule effectively was blaming its failure on foreign agents. President Eisenhower, continuing his flip-flop thinking on the issue, wrote that it now seemed that Nasser would be just as happy to see a temporary end to the struggle, and contacted our government and offered to attempt to use his influence to end the trouble. Camille Chamoun had sacrificed Lebanon's independence and neutrality on the altar of personal ambition and the extensive American aid that derived from subscribing to the Eisenhower Doctrine. Lebanese Muslims, who comprised most of Chamoun's opposition, were also galled that the Christian president had once again placed the country outside the mainstream of the Arab world, as he had done in 1956 when he refused to break relations with France and Great Britain following their invasion of Egypt. Chamoun himself had admitted the significance of his pro-American alignment in a revealing comment to Wilbur Crane Eveland. Eveland writes that in late April, I'd suggested that he might ease tensions by making a statement renouncing a move for re-election. Chamoun had snorted and suggested that I look at the calendar. March 23rd was a month behind us, and no amendment to permit another term could legally be passed after that date. Obviously, as he pointed out, the issue of the presidency was not the real issue. Renunciation of the Eisenhower Doctrine was what his opponents wanted. Instead of renouncing the doctrine, Chamoun invoked it. Although scattered fighting, at times heavy, was continuing in Lebanon, it was the coup in Iraq on July 14th that tipped the scales in favor of Chamoun making the formal request for military assistance and the United States immediately granting it. A CIA report of a plot against King Hussein of Jordan at about the same time heightened even further Washington's seemingly unceasing sense of urgency about the Middle East. Chamoun had, by this time, already announced his intention to step down from office when his term expired in September. He was now concerned about American forces helping him to stay alive until that date, as well as their taking action against the rebels. For the previous 2 months, fear of assassination had kept him constantly inside the presidential palace, never so much as approaching a window. The murder of the Iraqi king and prime minister during the coup was not designed to make him feel more secure. The Eisenhower Doctrine was put into motion not only in the face of widespread opposition to it within Lebanon, but in disregard of the fact that, even by the doctrine's own dubious provisions, the situation in Lebanon did not qualify. It could hardly be claimed that Lebanon had suffered armed aggression from any country controlled by international communism. If further evidence of this were needed, it was provided by veteran diplomat Robert Murphy, who was sent to Lebanon by Eisenhower a few days after the U.S. troops had landed. Murphy concluded, he later wrote, that communism was playing no direct or substantial part in the insurrection. Yet, Eisenhower could write that the American government was moving in accord with the provisions of the Middle East Resolution, Eisenhower Doctrine. But if the conflict expanded into something that the resolution did not cover, I would, given time, go to the Congress for additional authorization. Apparently, the president did not place too much weight on John Foster Dulles, having already determined that the resolution's mandate was open-ended. Thus, it was that American military forces were dispatched to Lebanon. Some 70 naval vessels and hundreds of aircraft took part in the operation, many remaining as part of the visible American presence. By July 25th, the U.S. forces on shore totaled at least 10,600. By August 13th, their number came to 14,000, more than the entire Lebanese army and gendarmerie combined. In my radio-TV address, wrote Eisenhower, I had been careful to use the term stationed in Lebanon rather than invading. This was likely a distinction lost upon many Lebanese, both high and low, supporters of the rebels and supporters of the government, including government tank forces who were prepared to block the entrance into Beirut of U.S. troops. Only the last-minute intercession on the spot by the American ambassador may have averted an armed clash. At a meeting between Robert Murphy and Lebanese Commander-in-Chief General Fouad Shahab, related by Eveland, who was briefed by Murphy afterwards, the American diplomat was warned that the Lebanese people were restless, resentful, and determined that Chamoun should resign and U.S. troops leave at once. Otherwise, the general could not be responsible for the consequences. For 15 years, his officers had acted behind his back. Now, he feared, they might revolt and attack the American forces. Murphy had listened patiently, Eveland relates, and then escorted the general to a window overlooking the sea. Pointing to the supercarrier Saratoga, swinging at anchor on the horizon, the president's envoy had quietly explained that just one of its aircraft, armed with nuclear weapons, could obliterate Beirut and its environs from the face of the earth. To this, Murphy quickly added that he'd been sent to be sure that it wouldn't be necessary for American troops to fire a shot. Shahab, he was certain, would ensure that there were no provocations on the Lebanese side. That, Murphy told me, ended the conversation. It now seemed that the general had regained control of his troops. None of the parties seemed to have considered what would have been the fate of the thousands of American military personnel in a Beirut obliterated from the face of the earth. Civil warfare in Lebanon increased in intensity in the 2 weeks following the American intervention. During this period, CIA transmitters in the Middle East were occupied in sending out propaganda broadcasts of disguised origin, a tactic frequently employed by the agency. In the case of one broadcast which has been reported, the apparent aim was to deflect anti-US feelings onto the Soviet Union and other targets. But the residents of the Middle East were not the only ones who may have been taken in by the spurious broadcast, for it was picked up by the American press and passed on to an unwitting American public. The following appeared in US newspapers. Beirut, July 23rd, UPI. A second mysterious Arab radio station went on the air yesterday calling itself the Voice of Justice and claiming to be broadcasting from Syria. Its program heard here consisted of bitter criticism against Soviet Russia and Soviet Premier Khrushchev. Earlier, the Voice of Iraq went on the air with attacks against the Iraqi revolutionary government. The Voice of Justice called Khrushchev the hangman of Hungary and warned the people of the Middle East they would suffer the same fate as the Hungarians if the Russians got a foothold in the Middle East. On July 31st, the Chamber of Deputies easily chose General Chehab to succeed Shamoun as president in September, an event that soon put a damper on the fighting in Lebanon and marked the beginning of the end of the conflict, which, in the final analysis, appears to have been more a violent protest than a civil war. Tension was further eased by the U.S. announcement shortly afterwards of its intention to withdraw a Marine battalion as a prelude to a general withdrawal. The last American troops left Lebanon in late October without having fired a shot in anger. What had their presence accomplished? The authors of the Pentagon study referred to earlier concluded that a balanced assessment of U.S. behavior in the Lebanon crisis is made difficult by the suspicion that the outcome might have been much the same if the United States had done nothing. Even Eisenhower expressed some doubt on this score. American intervention against the new Iraqi government was more covert. A secret plan for a joint U.S.-Turkish invasion of the country, codenamed Operation Cannonbone, was drafted by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff shortly after the coup in 1958. Reportedly, only Soviet threats to intercede on Iraq's side forced Washington to hold back. But in 1960, the United States began to fund the Kurdish guerrillas in Iraq who were fighting for a measure of autonomy. At the same time, the Iraqis, under Brig. General Abdul Karim Qasim, started to work towards the creation of an international organization to counter the power of the Western oil monopolies. This was to become OPEC, and was not received with joy in certain Western quarters. In February 1960, the Near East Division of the CIA's clandestine services requested that the agency find a way to incapacitate Qasim for promoting Soviet bloc political interests in Iraq. "We do not consciously seek subjects' permanent removal from the scene," said the Near East Division. "We also do not object should this complication develop." As matters turned out, the CIA mailed a monogrammed handkerchief containing an incapacitating agent to Qasim from an Asian country. If the Iraqi leader did in fact receive it, it certainly didn't kill him. That was left to his own countrymen who executed him 3 years later. The significance of the Lebanese intervention, as well as the shows of force employed in regard to Jordan and Syria, extended beyond the immediate outcomes. In the period before and after the intervention, Eisenhower, Dulles, and other Washington officials offered numerous different justifications for the American military action in Lebanon. Protecting American lives, protecting American property, the Eisenhower Doctrine with various interpretations, Lebanese sovereignty, integrity, independence, etc., U.S. national interest, world peace, collective self-defense, justice, international law, law and order, fighting Nasserism, the need to do something. In summing up the affair in his memoirs, President Eisenhower seemed to settle upon one rationale in particular, and this is probably the closest to the truth of the matter. This was to put the world, and specifically the Soviet Union and Nasser, on notice that the United States had virtually unlimited power, that this power could be transported to any corner of the world with great speed, that it could and would be used to deal decisively with any situation with which the United States was dissatisfied, for whatever reason. At the same time, it was a message to the British and the French that there was only one Western superpower in the post-war world, and that their days as great powers in the lands of oil were over. 14 Indonesia 1957 hingga 1958. War and pornography. I think it's time we held Sukarno's feet to the fire, said Frank Wisner, the CIA's deputy director of plans, covert operations. One day in autumn 1956, Wisner was speaking of the man who had led Indonesia since its struggle for independence from the Dutch following the war. A few months earlier, in May, Sukarno had made an impassioned speech before the U.S. Congress asking for more understanding of the problems and needs of developing nations like his own. The ensuing American campaign to unseat the flamboyant leader of the fifth most populous nation in the world was to run the gamut from large-scale military maneuvers to seedy sexual intrigue. The previous year, Sukarno had organized the Bandung Conference as an answer to the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, the U.S.-created political-military alliance of area states to contain communism. In the Indonesian city of Bandung, the doctrine of neutralism had been proclaimed as the faith of the underdeveloped world. To the men of the CIA station in Indonesia, the conference was heresy, so much so that their thoughts turned toward assassination as a means of sabotaging it. In 1975, the Senate committee which was investigating the CIA heard testimony that agency officers stationed in an East Asian country had suggested that an East Asian leader be assassinated to disrupt an impending communist SIG conference in 1955. In all likelihood, the leader referred to was either Sukarno or Zhou Enlai of China. But, said the committee, cooler heads prevailed at CIA headquarters in Washington and the suggestion was firmly rejected. Nevertheless, a plane carrying 8 members of the Chinese delegation, a Vietnamese, and 2 European journalists to the Bandung conference crashed under mysterious circumstances. The Chinese government claimed that it was an act of sabotage carried out by the US and Taiwan, a misfired effort to murder Zhou Enlai. The chartered Air India plane had taken off from Hong Kong on April 11, 1955 and crashed in the South China Sea. Zhou Enlai was scheduled to be on another chartered Air India flight a day or 2 later. The Chinese government, citing what it said were press reports from the Times of India, stated that the crash was caused by 2 time bombs apparently placed aboard the plane in Hong Kong. A clockwork mechanism was later recovered from the wrecked airliner, and the Hong Kong police called it a case of carefully planned mass murder. Months later, British police in Hong Kong announced that they were seeking a Chinese nationalist for conspiracy to cause the crash, but that he had fled to Taiwan. In 1967, a curious little book appeared in India, entitled I Was a CIA Agent in India, by John Disco Smith, an American. Published by the Communist Party of India, it was based on articles written by Smith for Literaturnia Gazeta in Moscow after he had defected to the Soviet Union around 1960. Smith, born in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1926, wrote that he had been a communications technician and code clerk at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi in 1955, performing tasks for the CIA as well. One of these tasks was to deliver a package to a Chinese nationalist, which Smith later learned, he claimed, contained the 2 time bombs used to blow up the Air India plane. The veracity of Smith's account cannot be determined, although his employment at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi from 1954 to 1959 is confirmed by the State Department Biographic Register. Elsewhere, the Senate committee reported that it had received some evidence of CIA involvement in plans to assassinate President Sukarno of Indonesia, and that the planning had proceeded to the point of identifying an agent whom it was believed might be recruited for the job. The committee noted that at one time, those at the CIA who were concerned with possible assassinations and appropriate methods were known internally as the Health Alteration Committee. To add to the concern of American leaders, Sukarno had made trips to the Soviet Union and China, though to the White House as well. He had purchased arms from Eastern European countries, but only after being turned down by the United States. He had nationalized many private holdings of the Dutch, and, perhaps most disturbing of all, the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, had made impressive gains electorally and in union organizing, thus earning an important role in the coalition government. It was a familiar third world scenario, and the reaction of Washington policymakers was equally familiar. Once again, they were unable or unwilling to distinguish nationalism from pro-communism, neutralism from wickedness. By any definition of the word, Sukarno was no communist. He was an Indonesian nationalist and a Sukarnoist who had crushed the PKI forces in 1948 after the independence struggle had been won. He ran what was largely his own show by granting concessions to both the PKI and the army, balancing one against the other. As to excluding the PKI, with its more than 1 million members, from the government, Sukarno declared, "I can't and won't ride a three-legged horse." To the United States, however, Sukarno's balancing act was too precarious to be left to the vagaries of the Indonesian political process. It mattered not to Washington that the Communist Party was walking the legal, peaceful road, or that there was no particular crisis or chaos in Indonesia, so favored as an excuse for intervention. Intervention there would be. It would not be the first. In 1955, during the national election campaign in Indonesia, the CIA had given $1 million to the Masjumi Party, a centrist coalition of Muslim organizations, in a losing bid to thwart Sukarno's Nationalist Party as well as the PKI. According to former CIA officer Joseph Burkholder Smith, the project provided for complete write-off of the funds. That is, no demand for a detailed accounting of how the funds were spent was required. I could find no clue as to what the Masjumi did with the $1 million. In 1957, the CIA decided that the situation called for more direct action. It was not difficult to find Indonesian colleagues in arms, for there already existed a clique of army officers and others who, for personal ambitions and because they disliked the influential position of the PKI, wanted Sukarno out, or at least out of their particular islands. Indonesia is the world's largest archipelago, consisting of some 3,000 islands. The military operation the CIA was opting for was of a scale that necessitated significant assistance from the Pentagon, which could be secured for a political action mission only if approved by the National Security Council's special group, the small group of top NSC officials who acted in the president's name, to protect him and the country by evaluating proposed covert actions and making certain that the CIA did not go off the deep end. Known at other times as the 5412 Committee, the 303 Committee, the 40 Committee, or the Operations Advisory Group. The manner in which the agency went about obtaining this approval is a textbook example of how the CIA sometimes determines American foreign policy. Joseph Burkholder Smith, who was in charge of the agency's Indonesian desk in Washington from mid-1956 to early 1958, has described the process in his memoirs. Instead of first proposing the plan to Washington for approval, where premature mention might get it shot down, we began to feed the State and Defense Department's intelligence that no one could deny was a useful contribution to understanding Indonesia. When they had read enough alarming reports, we planned to spring the suggestion we should support the Colonel's plans to reduce Sukarno's power. This was a method of operation which became the basis of many of the political action adventures of the 1960s and 1970s. In other words, the statement is false that CIA undertook to intervene in the affairs of countries like Chile only after being ordered to do so by the special group. In many instances, we made the action programs up ourselves after we had collected enough intelligence to make them appear required by the circumstances. Our activity in Indonesia in 1957 to 1958 was one such instance. Emphasis in original. When the Communist Party did well again in local elections held in July, the CIA viewed it as a great help to us in convincing Washington authorities how serious the Indonesian situation was. The only person who did not seem terribly alarmed at the PKI victories was Ambassador Allison. This was all we needed to convince John Foster Dulles finally that he had the wrong man in Indonesia. The wheels began to turn to remove this last stumbling block in the way of our operation. John Allison, wrote Smith, was not a great admirer of the CIA to begin with, and in early 1958, after less than a year in the post, he was replaced as ambassador by Howard Jones, whose selection pleased the CIA Indonesia staff. On November 30th, 1957, several hand grenades were tossed at Sukarno as he was leaving a school. He escaped injury, but 10 people were killed and 48 children injured. The CIA in Indonesia had no idea who was responsible, but it quickly put out the story that the PKI was behind it at the suggestion of their Soviet contacts in order to make it appear that Sukarno's opponents were wild and desperate men. As it turned out, the culprits were a Muslim group not associated with the PKI or with the agency's military plotters. The issue of Sukarno's supposed hand-in-glove relationship with communists was pushed at every opportunity. The CIA decided to make capital of reports that a good-looking blonde stewardess had been aboard Sukarno's aircraft everywhere he went during his trip in the Soviet Union, and that the same woman had come to Indonesia with Soviet President Klyman Voroshilov and had been seen several times in the company of Sukarno. The idea was that Sukarno's well-known womanizing had trapped him in the spell of a Soviet female agent. He had succumbed to Soviet control, CIA reports implied, as a result of her influence or blackmail, or both. This formed the foundation of our flights of fancy, wrote Smith. We had, as a matter of fact, considerable success with this theme. It appeared in the press around the world, and when Round Table, the serious British quarterly of international affairs, came to analyze the Indonesian revolt in its March 1958 issue, it listed Sukarno's being blackmailed by a Soviet female spy as one of the reasons that caused the uprising. Seemingly, the success of this operation inspired CIA officers in Washington to carry the theme one step further. A substantial effort was made to come up with a pornographic film, or at least some still photographs that could pass for Sukarno and his Russian girlfriend engaged in his favorite activity. When scrutiny of available porno films, supplied by the Chief of Police of Los Angeles, failed to turn up a couple who could pass for Sukarno, dark and bald, and a beautiful blonde Russian woman, the CIA undertook to produce its own films, the very films with which the Soviets were blackmailing Sukarno. The agency developed a full-face mask of the Indonesian leader, which was to be sent to Los Angeles, where the police were to pay some porno film actor to wear it during his big scene. This project resulted in at least some photographs, although they apparently were never used. Another outcome of the blackmail effort was a film produced for the CIA by Robert Maheu, former FBI agent and intimate of Howard Hughes. Maheu's film starred an actor who resembled Sukarno. The ultimate fate of the film, which was entitled Happy Days, has not been reported. In other parts of the world, at other times, the CIA has done better in this line of work, having produced sex films of target subjects caught in flagrante delicto who had been lured to agency safe houses by female agents. In 1960, Colonnello, Truman Smith, U.S. Army Ret, writing in Reader's Digest about the KGB, declared, "It is difficult for most of us to appreciate its menace, as its methods are so debased as to be all but beyond the comprehension of any normal person with a sense of right and wrong. One of the KGB methods the good colonel found so debased was the making of sex films to be used as blackmail. People depraved enough to employ such methods," he wrote, "find nothing distasteful in more violent methods. Sex could be used at home as well to further the goals of American foreign policy." Under the cover of the U.S. Foreign Aid Program, at that time called the Economic Cooperation Administration, Indonesian policemen were trained and then recruited to provide information on Soviet, Chinese, and PKI activities in their country. Some of the men singled out as good prospects for this work were sent to Washington for special training and to be softened up for recruitment. Like Sukarno, reportedly, these police officers invariably had an obsessive desire to sleep with a white woman. Accordingly, during their stay, they were taken to Baltimore's shabby sex district to indulge themselves. The special group's approval of the political action mission was forthcoming in November 1957, and the CIA's paramilitary machine was put into gear. In this undertaking, as in others, the agency enjoyed the advantage of the United States' far-flung military empire. Headquarters for the operation were established in neighboring Singapore, courtesy of the British. Training bases set up in the Philippines. Airstrips laid out in various parts of the Pacific to prepare for bomber and transport missions. Indonesians, along with Filipinos, Taiwanese, Americans, and other soldiers of fortune, were assembled in Okinawa and the Philippines along with vast quantities of arms and equipment. For this, the CIA's most ambitious military operation to date, tens of thousands of rebels were armed, equipped and trained by the U.S. Army. U.S. Navy submarines, patrolling off the coast of Sumatra, the main island, put over the beach parties ashore along with supplies and communications equipment. The U.S. Air Force set up a considerable air transport force which airdropped many thousands of weapons deep into Indonesian territory. And a fleet of 15 B-26 bombers was made available for the conflict after being sanitized to ensure that they were non-attributable and that all airborne equipment was deniable. In the early months of 1958, Rebellion began to break out in one part of the Indonesian island chain, then another. CIA pilots took to the air to carry out bombing and strafing missions in support of the rebels. In Washington, Colonello Alex Cawalaro, the Indonesian military attaché, was persuaded by the agency to defect. He soon showed up in Indonesia to take charge of the rebel forces. Yet, as the fighting dragged on into spring, the insurgents proved unable to win decisive victories or take the offensive, although the CIA bombing raids were taking their toll. He stated that 700 casualties had resulted from this single run. On May 15th, a CIA plane bombed the Ambon marketplace, killing a large number of civilians on their way to church on Ascension Thursday. The Indonesian government had to act to suppress public demonstrations. 3 days later, during another bombing run over Ambon, a CIA pilot, Alan Lawrence Pope, was shot down and captured. 30 years old, from Perrine, Florida, Pope had flown 55 night missions over communist lines in Korea for the Air Force. Later, he spent 2 months flying through communist flak for the CIA to drop supplies to the French at Dien Bien Phu. Now his luck had run out. He was to spend 4 years as a prisoner in Indonesia before Sukarno acceded to a request from Robert Kennedy for his release. Pope was captured carrying a set of